Hey my friends, this is Wayne Yap, and today I would like to share with you 3 of the concepts that I think are most important for you to improve your preflop game. The first one is that you really need to steal the blinds, because to be honest, the game of poker is really completely about stealing the blinds. And the reason this is so is that if you imagine a model where the poker game just starts with the button and nobody is putting in any kinds of blinds or antes, what would happen at equilibrium? I mean, you can just let somebody play a weak hand, and let's say we give people the category of hands ace, king, queen, jack, 10. We give them 5 hands, so ace is stronger than king, king is stronger than queen, queen is stronger than jack, jack is stronger than 10, just like in regular poker. But there's no 2 cards combinations, it's just ace high, king high, and what happens is that at the end, everybody will only start playing the ace, because if one person starts playing the, let's say one person decides to play a queen, and another player decides to loosen up their range a little bit to exploit that player by playing the king, what happens is that he will lose money against all the other players that are only waiting for the ace. So in the long run, the only strategy that works is to play the ace. And when that comes to Texas Hold'em or No Limit Hold'em, people can't even play kings if there are no blinds. Everybody will just be folding and folding and folding. You could try to play kings, but people are just going to fold until they get aces, and then they will win you. If people started incorporating kings into their range as well, they would just basically be bleeding money, because when other people get aces, they are going to win your money. So playing with kings is actually minus EV. And when you understand this, you realize that, hey, poker is really just actually all about stealing the blinds. If nobody is putting in dead money, you wouldn't put any money into the pot either. And then we come to a game of poker where there's a small blind and there's a big blind. We'll just have a simple model with no antes for now. In this model, what happens is that everybody has some incentive to steal the blinds, and the blinds need to defend against those steals. So if you think about it, the button has less people to act behind him. So basically, when the button is going to go for a steal or raise first in, he only has to worry about the small blind and the big blind behind him. And therefore, his steal percentage usually goes between 30 to 60%, depending on what kind of strategy you're running. And as the positions get worse, so from the button, the next position is cut off. As you would imagine, the cutoff has 3 players to think about behind him now, where the button is added in on top of the small blind and the big blind. And therefore, he really can't steal as white, because the button, if the button has a hand that is stronger than cutoff's range, or even equivalent to the cutoff's range, he has positional advantage and he can play those hands profitably. On top of that, the button really can't just keep waiting for a spot to steal the blinds, because if that's his strategy, then the players who have worse position than him is gonna steal a lot of the blinds more often than they're supposed to. So therefore, it is quite important to protect your button as well. And when you understand how this translates from button to cutoff, you realize that, hey, if you go down to hijack or low jack or MP, however many MP positions there are, and then let's say under the gun 1, under the gun 2, under the gun, so on, it really just is the same. You just have to play tighter and tighter as you go further away from the button, because there are more people left to act behind you. That's why in a 6-max game, when there are only 4 out of 4 positions before the blinds, you can still play relatively loose compared to a 9-max game. So now that you understand that poker is about stealing the blinds, then the next concept I would like to explain to you is realizable equity. And first, we have to, in order to understand realizable equity, we have to understand what equity is first. Equity is basically if the game ends at that spot. So let's say preflop, we both go all in, I have pocket 2s, you have ace king, we are basically almost a coin flip. If it's on the flop, it would be that, hey, when the flop comes, the game will have ended. So it's in a way like both players are promising to check it down. So that is actually how much equity you have in the sense that the percentage of the time you win the pot is basically your equity. And what it means to have realizable equity is that when you actually have equity in a pot, so for example, if I am in position, I have ace king, and out of position has pocket twos. It's a spot where the in position player will realize much more equity because ace king is a lot easier to play, and out of position player, can't be sure that you only have ace king. So in this spot, when out of position player is playing against a range that has some ace king, sometimes ace king is able to realize more equity. And there are many different factors in terms of how much you can realize your equity. The first one is that whenever you have position, you realize more equity. This is because you have the chance to act after the first player has acted, or in a multi-way spot, you are the one who gets to act last. The reason is that acting last allows you to make more accurate decisions. Imagine a spot where both players have pretty equal kind of ranges. The out of position player, it's very hard to play well because if the out of position player bets his strong hands and some bluffs, the in position player can react perfectly, already seeing that out of position player has bet. So if out of position is splitting between betting and checking, his checking range in that spot will just be a lot of very middling hands, and the in position player can polarize his range extremely well, which means he can bet his value hands and fit in just enough bluffs to make out of position player indifferent. And when out of position player does bet that polarized range, the in position player now just has a lot more hands that he can call compared to out of position, because he doesn't have to remove the top part of his range before defending with the bluff catchers. If you understand, maybe I should draw an example for you to see. And so if both players have very similar ranges in this spot, and this is out of position, this is in position. Basically, when out of position plays and he wants to make a value bet and bluffs, he's mixing his value bets here and his bluffs here. So this is value bet and this is bluffs. What happened here is that when he does mix these value bets and bluffs, the in position player here actually can defend accurately with his bluff catchers, plus on top of that he has a lot of value hands on top. So now he's able to defend this portion of his range well against the out of position player. And this is when out of position player bets. If out of position player checks, now out of position player always has this portion of his range here, and in position player still has his entire range. So he can actually polarize his range extremely accurately and even include potentially more value hands, because they would be able to value bet against this portion of range even though they don't beat the entire bluff catching range, as long as it beats a reasonable amount. So what ends up happening here is that in position player can actually end up widening his value betting range to become wider than out of position's value betting range, and even widen the amount of bluffs that he has, and then only just check behind a middle portion, or maybe sometimes with some give ups, if you have some give ups at the bottom, even lower than this. And when in position is able to bet more frequently with a correct polarized strategy, in position gets to realize more equity. And that is one reason why basically acting last gives you more equity. Another important point of when you get to realize more equity is that if you are more polarized, you end up realizing more equity. And how this realizable equity situation translate to pre-flop is that there are three things. So it's being out of position first, second is not having a polarized range, and third is having a weaker range. All three of these factors contribute to having less realizable equity. And you can apply this to your pre-flop game by realizing that, hey, if you are defending on the big blind against a button or a cutoff steal and you're calling here, even though your raw equity, when you input it into a program, shows that it is quite high, you have to apply a significant discount because of that 3 factors. Firstly, you're out of position. Secondly, you have a weak range, and so therefore, I mean, polarized or not, it depends on the the flop that comes out. But you can't control for that third factor, and usually you don't have the polarized range. So since you have all 3 disadvantages, you usually have to discount yourself by 30 to 50% in terms of equity, realizable equity. What that means is that you should just be playing a lot tighter than your equity actually allows you to play from on the big blind and the small blind. But given that you're on the big blind and small blind and you have the dead blinds in play, you actually get a really good pot odds, and you usually don't need that much realizable equity in total to actually play. So it's kind of like a trade-off, and you end up playing still fairly loose in those spots. Next is that if you're early position in a 9-max game especially, you basically usually you have a strong range, but you don't get to realize so much of your equity because you're going to be out of position. When you raise here and in position calls, there are a lot of bots. For example, ace high bots, you are just forced to check really often. And you just basically, since you're realizing so little equity out of position, you are really far from the blinds, and therefore you have a lot more people to worry about as well for stealing the blinds. You should just be playing extremely tight in those early positions. Lastly, if you're in late position like the cutoff or the button, you actually get to realize a lot more equity, so therefore you can play quite loose. So this realizable equity stacks up with the concepts that I explained to you in point number 1, makes you able to play a lot looser in late positions than maybe intuitively possible if you don't understand the statistics or game theory aspect of the game. So lastly, the last aspect that I wanted to mention to you, and you heard me talk about this when I mentioned point number 2, is basically polarized range versus linear range. And what this really means is that, so for example, if we go back to this picture where we are value betting a top portion of our range and bluffing the bottom of our range, and we have this middle part that we are say checking, or we are taking a passive action, so it's usually checking. Sometimes it can be calling, and this is raise or this is fold, and this could be raised as well. So basically, a polarized range is when you are splitting your chunk into a top part that is value, so the value is here, and the middle part you take a more passive action. Whereas if you are talking about a linear range, you are just basically taking the top chunk here to play, and the rest you take the passive action. So there are times and places for both of this, and majority of the time in a game like Hold'em or even PLO, playing a linear range is much more effective, because why would you put more money in with your weaker hands when you can put money in with your better hands? So in a lot of positions, for example, if you are stealing the blinds pre-flop, you always want to use the linear range. You're under the gun and you want to play about 10%. You just take the best 10% of hands in poker and play those. You don't need to have 5% of good hands and 5% bluffs. Maybe you have some kind of different equity hands like suited connector sometimes to have a bit more board coverage, but that's another factor for another time. As it relates to interesting spots of when to use linear and when to use polarized, the thing that is worth more discussing in greater detail is that in a spot where somebody has raised or somebody has limped, and now you're thinking, okay, let's just stick with the topic about somebody has raised, and you're thinking about whether to 3-bet him or not. I would say that in basically almost all positions, it's a lot simpler to play and a lot more resilient of a strategy to use the linear range to just 3-bet with those. The only exception and the only place that you should be aware that you can implement a polarized range is when you are in the big blind and somebody has raised and you are last to act. The reason for playing a polarized range in this spot is that it works really well, because if you are re-raising the top part of your range, so basically if this part of your range here that ends around this point is plus EV to play against the open, you So plus EV to play means you could either call or you could 3-bet. The reason that it's so nice to have a polarized range is that you get to call the middle part of your range, and then you get to 3-bet the top part of your range, and then you 3-bet the bottom part of your range. But there are a lot of hands that are just outside of the, so they are here, these circles, little circles that I draw. They are not profitable enough for you to be calling with those hands. But if you start 3-betting in those hands, they actually, when you use a solver, it actually shows that you are plus EV with these hands. Therefore, you get to widen up the total number of hands that you play, and when you widen up the total number of hands that you play, and the extra hands are plus EV hands, it increases the overall EV of your strategy, and it increases the overall EV of your game tree. So yeah, I shall leave it here for now in terms of my 3 most important concepts for preflop play. If you like this sort of content, definitely come to my Facebook group and join in the discussions, ask questions, follow, like my page on Facebook so that you get to access to more of this kind of videos. And I'll see you next time.